Hello. It is Writing Wednesday, the end of January, and I thought, and I'm Janet Fitch, and this is, I've been asked to talk about, well, actually, the question had been about fan fiction, and what are you allowed to do and what aren't you allowed to do, and it to me that opened up an entire question that was more than just a discussion of fan fiction. Um, it's a let's I'd like to do today's Writing Wednesday about works based on other works. So this is not necessarily fan fiction. I Hi, nice to see you. It's nice, this is a topic that fan fiction is a very popular activity. And I think of it more as an activity than a genre. Fan fiction is not fiction written by somebody who intends to be a writer. Fan fiction is stimulated by the love of a certain author or a certain work, usually, and stimulating people to want to continue the story as they imagine it would continue, or to inhabit character that they love, that they try to imagine a side story, a backstory, a secondary story. And I think that the concerns of writers can be similar to that. What would lead someone to write a sequel to some other book? They must admire it. But there's something slightly different in what writers try to do when they base a work on another work. They're looking often for echoes, where they can express their own concerns, their own times. Hi. And use a foundational text to respond to that text, to explore, just like fan fiction, explore a secondary character, but there'll usually be a bigger reason for wanting to do so than just continuing George R.R. Martin's world. Usually the world is what changes when you move from fan fiction to literature based on another work of literature. So what's, many, important, interesting, and skilled craftspeople, writers, have decided to base works on other works, because literature is a conversation that continues to be in progress. We're always in conversation with the literature of the past. That's why people who, hi, welcome to live. Here's somebody, Vicky, who doesn't always get to catch me live, so this is cool. Welcome. So we're talking about the difference between writers who write works based on works of literature and fan fiction. I think fan fiction attempts to remain in the style of the original, which is usually the opposite of what a more serious writer, hi Linda, what a more serious writer wants to do is respond to another writer's work as an equal, as somebody with their own unique viewpoint, with their own unique voice, which is not what fan fiction is for. It's not, because it's not a writer's impulse. It is an impulse to continue the same experience that you got from the original. Whereas a writer, a writer with some voice or ambition or point of view will want to make the story their own, to respond to classic literature or a work that was very stimulating. Generally, you only in satire are you responding to someone in your own generation. When people write works in response to their contemporaries, is where people begin to accuse each other. Where questions of plagiarism emerge, where somebody has taken a bit too much of somebody else's work who is still very much alive, or even if they're dead. The how much imagination and divergence of style and divergence of intent marks of work of literature based on another work of literature. So I wanted to talk about some of the possibilities of writing about other people, other stories, and who has done it, and what stories of interest. Right now, I am reading this because Linda actually brought it up. I'm reading Wide Sargasso Sea. And Wide Sargasso Sea was written by Jean Rhys in the R-H-Y-S in the 60s, 1960s. At the end of her life, she was an older woman. She had been written all her life. She was from the Caribbean, and she wrote a book responding to Jane Eyre, which was an early book, early novel in the 1800s, written by Charlotte Bronte. Jane Bronte? One of the Brontes. Jane, I think. Jane? Yeah. Anyway. Somebody will remember. And that's an interesting novel anyway, because Jane Eyre was written by a woman at a time when there were very few occupations available to women. Women could be, if you were unmarried without a great fortune, you tended to be a governess of other people's children, your sister's children, your husband's children. You were automatically put to work. So to have income of one's own, work of one's own, in a certain era, there were very few professions open to women. You could become a prostitute, you could go on the stage, or you could become a writer. And educated middle-class women, it was something they could do. So Jane Eyre is kind of an important book in any case. But then there was a secondary character, unseen, the mad woman in the attic, the first Mrs. Rochester, who was from the Caribbean. And Jean Rhys, who was from the Caribbean, wrote a story, a short novel that it's just terrifying. It's very short, like 180 pages. It's about the first Mrs. Rochester, who eventually became the woman in the attic. I can't figure out yet, but I'm seeing her story in the Caribbean as the daughter of kind of degenerate white slave owners in the Caribbean in the 1830s, just as it's been outlawed by England. The slave trade has been outlawed. And there were slave riots, rebellions in the Caribbean, and they were really people who were considered white cockroaches. They were hounded, they were haunted, and evidently this Jean imagines she knows more about the life of the first Mrs. Rochester up there in the attic And so it's absolutely terrifying because you know the fate of this woman, because she's taking from great literature. The thing is that we do know the story, so it adds, in this case, it adds to the suspense of the sort of a prequel, which I hate those words, sequel, prequel, but the prequel to Jane Eyre. We already know what happens to this woman, so everything is terrifying from the word go. It reminds me a lot of The Lover, the beginning of The Lover, set in it's white colonials in the tropics, and the danger and the people who really don't have a legitimate place where they are. It just makes a fascinating read. And so we're talking about like why somebody would be stimulated to write a book after another book. Why did Van Gogh paint paintings after other painters? Because there's something stimulating about their composition that he wanted to try. In fiction, it's usually there's a story that the author wants to tell that has overtones from that other work. So, as we are always in conversation with literature of the past, as we're writers, these works are very much a part of the writer. When Jane Smiley wrote A Thousand Acres, which is based on King Lear, everybody who has had an education is aware of the story of King Lear, so that she doesn't have to call it, King Lear updated. She doesn't have to call anybody by those names, because we recognize the paw of Shakespeare in there, and the audacity of a writer to write about farmers in Iowa, and we're reading, we go, oh my God, this is King Lear. It adds such a layer of expectation. We know the story. We know, how suspenseful this is going to be, how way out this is going to be. And they're Iowa farmers. Like, how is she going to do this? It was tremendously audacious. She did win the National Book Award for it. Or was it the Pulitzer? One of the big ones. And so sometimes it's wanting to take one of these touchstone narratives from our Western culture and try it out on a specific locale with specific people of our own time, and how would that play out. So this is not fan fiction. This is not like saying, oh, let's write something about King Lear. This is like, let's borrow the structure of King Lear and the resonance and the harm, the drama of King Lear, and move it up 400 years and put it in the middle of America. Let's make an American story about it. Does it change the story? How does it change the story? What does it say about us? The resonant space between the original work and the work that the author is creating in the present. It was fascinating, and it was very well done. I mean, Shakespeare, that was a play, and Jane Smiley turned it into a long dramatic novel about America, set in America. That these stories, there aren't, people can say, there aren't a billion stories in the world. There are some very foundational, archetypical, if you're talking in Jungian terms, stories that resonate throughout culture, our culture, and often other cultures. You think about the works that have been written in response to the Odyssey. You have everything from Aeneas's, the Aeneid, which is basically the a Roman version of the Odyssey. You have one of the great texts of the 20th century, Ulysses, based on the Odyssey, encounter by encounter, but Joyce was going to put his own language and his own genius to the wheel to bring it absolutely to life in 1906 Dublin with 3 characters. Each chapter, different style. I mean, he is showing you that he can do pirouettes on top of a pillar, and spin the plates and do everything. But it's a fine tradition. I was looking up some of the other works that some surprised me. I had no idea Bridget Jones's Diary was based on Pride and Prejudice. You have Belzar by Meg Wolitzer, was written about in response to the bell jar. The Hours uses Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf's, and Virginia Woolf's personal story. There's been a ton of responses to Gone with the Wind. There's been books from the points of view of just about everyone in that book in response. There have been, and some of them are a little more fan fiction-y than others. There's books, many of them, who take a minor character and make a major character out of them. Those are really interesting. People say, oh, that character, we need to know more about them. Evidently, On Beauty was based on Forster's Howard's End. There's a book that I love that is Grendel by John Gardner, who wrote the book about writing, my favorite writing book, The Art of Fiction. And Grendel tells the Beowulf story, one of the classics in Western literature, from the point of view of the monster. Grendel is the monster who is attacking people, and Beowulf fights him. Well, the monster has a point of view too, and books that take the villain's point of view, or ostensibly the villain, Wicked, it does the Oz story. This is a very contemporary kind of thing to do. It's saying everybody has their point of view. You don't know what somebody else has gone through and why they are. Be more curious as to why they are. That's kind of a common ground to much contemporary fiction. Let's take another look at these people. Let's not assume we know them. Let's not assume that we're a monster. Everybody's a monster who is perceived as a monster by someone. It pulls back. It's aware that history is written by the winner, and it pulls back and goes, wait a second. Other books based on other books, evidently 2666 by Bolaño was written on based on a nonfiction book called Bones in the Desert, which was never translated into English. There have been books based on Don Quixote. Evidently, Borges did a short story called Pierre Minot, author of the Quixote. Alternative versions of these great legends. A terrific book that was published recently is Madeline Miller's Circe, which is based on one of the characters in the Odyssey, the witch, where she turns Odysseus's men to pigs, but not Odysseus, and he gets to hang out with her for like 7 years. He's in no hurry to rush home. And it imagines the life of this minor deity, this minor immortal. Pretty interesting. To inhabit. I have a friend who wrote alternative stories in the Bible. A woman named Mary Rakow wrote a book called This Is Why I Came, and did stories from the points of view of characters in the Bible. And Bible doesn't have much point of view. You don't inhabit those characters as real people. They have their one function, and that's what they do, and that's what they're there for. But Rakow inhabits them. Like, how would it feel to know that your son is going to die? How does it feel to know that your father almost killed you? How does it feel to be in the Bible stories, a confrontation with God? That is a profoundly disturbing thing when you're actually being that person. Carlos Fuentes, Where the Air is Clean, or Where the Air is Clear, is based on Dos Passos' Manhattan Transfer. You never know what people are going to be attracted to, respond to. So if you are interested and you don't have anything particular that you're working on, and think, God, I've always loved that, or been upset by this book, and to write something in response. It's not responding to this time, not trying out their language and noticing how they're handling the language, is what we were talking about, building your style and taking a look at that. But this is about story, and taking a story that's well known and turning it in some way. Some people have done wonderful satires and parodies, is another way to respond to work. So, like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies was a very successful parody of Pride and Prejudice. So what's the difference between fan fiction and literature? And then what's the difference between plagiarism and basing your work on somebody else's work? If it's a classic work, you have a little bit more of a leg to stand on in terms of borrowing incident, filtered through your own sensibility. When it's a contemporary work, you better be diverging from it pretty deeply. If I want to react to, say, a Cheever story about a man who is trying to ditch his mistress, and they take a train trip together, I would ask myself, what is it about the story that so moves me? And then just like life, find a situation that will carry that emotion and that moment without mirroring it. Somebody got into a lot of trouble, big argument with Francine Prose, who is not only a novelist but a great critic. And she had found a short story that was based almost 100% on a story of a contemporary writer. Is Mavis Gallant's story called The Ice Wagon Going Down the Street. And the story was Canadians in Geneva. And this author had taken almost the entire story, except that made it, Pakistanis in Canada. It was too close. It was too close, and especially a short story. Just use that as a springboard. Don't try to, hit all the dramatic points, because if you do, people will definitely call you on it. Other interesting ways that you can do a mashup. I loved this book. I interviewed the author, Howard Rodman, The Great Eastern, which is a mashup of Moby Dick, Captain Ahab from Moby Dick and Captain Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea come together in this Victorian kind of steampunk fantasy. A wonderful book, and very well done, because when you mash up two characters like that, obviously you're not trying to reenact either book, but imagining a third creature. Parody is a wonderful way to interact with something that you think has comic potential. Very sincere books often are just begging for a good parody. But fan fiction tends to try to stay in the style of that original and continue the dream and continue the work that the writer has stopped working on, but the fan just wants more of that book. Whereas an author, say you're reading something and you're just dying to know what happens after that, and this is the only book. It's not. It is somewhat more problematic, that you really need to know why you are continuing the story. It's not just necessarily continuing the adventures, but you have a reason to think there something also of interest needs to be said, something that you need to say, and you're going to use this to say what you need to say. The sequels to Gone with the Wind are very interesting that way. There is The Wind Done Gone, which is a parody, is trying to, include, a very obvious and necessary modern observation about race that is not really examined as much as it should be or could be in Gone with the Wind, which was trying to do a kind of romantic epic. There's almost fan fiction based on it. There's a book that was Rhett Butler's story. Somebody thought that would be an interesting thing to continue, and was able to get it some deeper history through Butler's kind of ambiguous position between the North and the South. People see, and then there's other fans of those books just love those further explorations. But each of them has their own intent, and not necessarily imitating the style. Some are intended to be continuations. Some are definitely divergent and want to comment on the book in a different way. So any questions? Anybody has ever been tempted to write fan fiction or write in response? There's been a million responses to the Odyssey. That's one of the foundational stories. So you have poets like Derek Walcott did this is not the Odyssey, this is the Iliad. He did an epic poem, a book-length poem called Homages, and it's the Iliad, the Trojan War story, Helen and all that, set on a Caribbean island. I think it was St. Lucia. I think that's where Walcott is from. He won a Nobel. It is absolutely fantastic, and it has its own inner weight. It doesn't try to completely do, moment by moment, scene by scene. Am I going to write a novel based on a character from classic work? I would not say no. it's the kind of thing that everybody's tempted to do from time to time, to take a character or a situation of a classic piece of literature and see where you go with it. Many people have done the Inferno, they've done the Odyssey, the Iliad, a lot of Pride and Prejudice, a lot of Austen. It's I'm reading The Golden Gate right now, which is in response to Eugene Onegin, Pushkin. Yeah, I would think of it. Has anybody else tried it? So fan fiction of a New Zealand TV show. I think that that's a sequel of my own book. What's Ingrid Magnusson up to? I think many young writers, teens, start by writing fan fiction. So it's a lot for a young writer to create characters. They tend to shape their creative work around work that they have seen, rather than experiences that they have had. And then it's just learning to handle the palette, the tools, the paints, the paints and the brushes and the canvases, and how to write fiction. It's not a bad way to learn to write fiction for young people. Now, what else can I tell you about using? There's so much literature that's made this way, and it can be as startling as the Wide Sargasso Sea, or as mundane as a sequel to Gone with the Wind called Scarlet. I think the ones based on minor characters are more interesting, things that is let's shift the point of view, and then the ones that completely move into a different time and place and different milieu and concerns. And just be careful when you're working with contemporary writing. You have to be a lot more careful. What else can I tell you? If you want to do fan fiction about, somebody asked me this question, I want to do fan fiction about some book that they were stricken by, and is this gonna can I get it published? And it's like, probably not. If you're gonna write a continuation of Song of Fire and Ice, that's really fun to do, but you are not going to get it published. These are works are so copyrighted, and their lawyers will come and kill you. So do it if you want to do it for yourself. Absolutely do it. But if you want to write a book based on that kind of fantasy, make sure it's different enough. Don't use Jon Snow. You're going to be in trouble. All right. So I'd like to read a book about Rebecca. And what was interesting is Rebecca was based on Jane Eyre. So, because I was reading The Wide Sargasso Sea and thinking, God, this reminds me a lot of Rebecca. And of course it did, because Rebecca was based on Jane Eyre. Isn't that interesting? I'm writing noir, as Linda was saying here, and I'm not basing it on, this last one was based more on direct personal experience, but the first one that I did had the method in Los Angeles noir definitely had overtones of Sunset Boulevard, which has marked us all. and also certain aspects of double indemnity, but especially Sunset Boulevard has become also like, just like King Lear. It's part of the way we think. It's the conversation we have with literature of the past. And the method is going to be shot this month, where it's going to be a movie. So that's good news. All right. Well, if there are no other questions on the subject, thank you. If there are no other questions on the subject of fan fiction versus literature and what the difference might be, I wish you a good week. And if there's anything you'd like me to do next week for Writing Wednesday, just leave it in comments. All righty. Thank you. Bye.